Bond. James Bond.
The James Bond films, the prime action extravaganzas that since 1962 had given entertainment to millions and millions of people all around the world, following British super spy James Bond as he goes around the world saving it from ambitious bad guys bent on unleashing harm and destruction on a mass scale. There are so many amazing things about the Bond films. The actors who have played Bond, the ladies, the theme, the individual scores, the cinematography, the action scenes, and the stunts. And that's what this video is going to be about. The iconic stunts of this whole series that are some of the most eye-popping stunts ever committed to celluloid. This video will not be covering the 1967 version of Casino Royale or Never Say Never Again, because those films were not Eon Productions films, which was Cubby Broccoli's production company that produced all the Bond films even up to this day.
Things have been awfully dull around here. I hope we're going to have some gratuitous sex and violence.
I certainly hope so, too.
The Sean Connery era in the 1960s and 1971 was an era where stunts didn't really reach the level of spectacularness that we saw later on with the Roger Moore films and after that. The Sean Connery era produced films, at least the first two, Dr. No and From Russia with Love, were more like hard-boiled international detective stories rather than dazzling pieces of entertainment. Goldfinger was the first Bond film that was made as dazzling entertainment. But still, the action sequences in the Connery-era films largely relied on gunfights, special effects, and raw destruction. Although there were spectacular scenes that hold up fairly well even today, the stunts were fairly simple in comparison to what came afterwards. Thunderball, the fourth James Bond film, has a notable scene where Bond sneaks into the main bad guy's home and he gets pulled into a pool with a guard. The pool is then covered over, and Bond seemingly has no way out. Then, Largo, the main bad guy, has his men open an underwater tunnel for his fictional golden grotto sharks to come and devour Bond and the dead guard. Then, Bond finds a way out, through the tunnel. So Connery did this for real, with plexiglass separating him and the sharks, and he was not acting when the sharks would come at him. The shot where Bond gets out just in time before being attacked by a shark was a rigged dead shark pulled by a wire underwater by on-set special effects supervisor John Steers.
Sorry, old chap. Better luck next time.
At the start of the film, Bond fights a bad guy in a church in France, and he escapes the church using none other than a jetpack. This very real jetpack, made by American aerospace company Bell Textron, had only 2 people in the world qualified to fly it, and both men were brought to France to fly it for the shots where Bond escapes from the church. All the shots you see with Connery were filmed against a rear projection screen in Pinewood Studios, and the shots where Bond is flying the jetpack where you don't see Connery's face were filmed with the jetpack pilots. Filming the actors against front projection or later blue or green screen is something that will be mentioned often in this video. One notable scene in Diamonds Are Forever, the 7th Bond film and Connery's last with Eon Productions, is the car chase after Bond escapes from a secret laboratory.
Why, you dirty bat!
When the car chase ensues, you can see a crowd having nothing to do with the movie innocently standing on the sidewalk watching the chase being filmed. At the end of the sequence, Bond puts the car in a 45-degree tilt and goes through a narrow alleyway.
I got you now.
Lean over.
After some modifications were done to the car, this was done for real with an actual Ford Mustang Mach 1 on a set at the Universal Studios backlot in Los Angeles, but there was a problem. The team that got the shot with the Mach 1 coming out of the alleyway got the shot with the car tilting on the wrong side, and since they lacked the budget and the time to redo the shot, they had to do a shot in Pinewood Studios of the car tilting from its right wheels to its left wheels. Before we get into the next segment, Pinewood Studios, the film studios just outside London where sets were built for the Bond films to be filmed in, is a location you will hear often in this video. The Roger Moore era of Bond from 1973 to 1985 started to see stunts and filmmaking of far greater sophistication and complexity thanks to the films becoming bigger and therefore more expensive to produce. The 8th James Bond film, and Moore's first, Live and Let Die, featured a scene where Bond is left to be eaten alive by crocodiles, and he then sees 5 crocodiles lined up just before he is about to be taken into the water. He then jumps and walks over these 5 crocodiles into relative safety. Although this takes place in Mississippi, this was filmed at a crocodile farm in Jamaica owned by a guy named Ross Kananga, whom they named the main bad guy after. A hardened crocodile farmer, Kananga was a man who knew no fear. At his theme park, Jamaica Swamp Safari, he would wrestle these crocodiles as part of a show. Kananga grew up around crocodiles, as his father used to do shows with them, and he was hardened to the point where, as a boy, he actually watched his own father being eaten alive by crocodiles. After picking the 5 biggest crocodiles, he and his crew tied down these live crocodiles by their feet, and Kananga then actually performed the stunt himself, and after 4 attempts, he got it right on the 5th take. A little later, Bond escapes the farm in a boat, and he gets to a strip of narrow land with another bad guy waiting for him there, and legendary comic relief sheriff J.W. Pepper is there too, about to arrest the bad guy for excess speeding. So Bond decides to jump the land to the other side where the river continues on. This stunt was done in October 1972, and the boat was driven by stuntman Jerry Comeau at an astonishing speed of 75 miles an hour, or 120 kilometers an hour, and he traveled 115 feet, about 35 meters in midair. However, the second boat that jumped over got caught in the wake of the first boat, and it went right and crashed into land. The driver was okay. In the 9th James Bond film, The Man with the Golden Gun, one of the most famous of Bond stunts, the AMC Pacer car roll in Thailand, was done. While chasing Scaramanga, the main bad guy, Bond and Sheriff Pepper, who he somehow ran into, is on the opposite side of a river where Scaramanga is. Knowing he has to cross to the other side, he sees an incomplete ramp that will allow him to do so at incredible risk. Typical of Bond, he does so. The car does a full barrel roll and lands on its wheels. This stunt was the first ever to be engineered by a computer. Stunt coordinator W.J. Milligan had done a similar stunt at the Astrodome in Houston, Texas, and this caught the eye of producer Albert Cubby Broccoli. There had to be a lot of preparation. The US government computer simulated how such a stunt could be done, and they built the ramps to the computer's specification, and they had to rebuild the car and ensure that it was perfectly balanced. The driver actually had to sit in the middle. Massive safety precautions were taken. There were divers in the river just in case the car landed upside down in the water. And a stuntman named Leon Bumps Willert got in the car, drove it to exactly 49 miles an hour, did the jump, and the car landed perfectly on the first take. Broccoli was so impressed that he went up to Willard and stuffed a whole bunch of $100 bills in his pocket for his work. One of the most eye-catching scenes in the 13th Bond film, Octopussy, was the train battle, where Bond battles bad guys on top of a moving train. This was done for real, and the scenes where the actors' faces were seen were filmed on a set in Pinewood Studios, whilst the actual train fight was done by stuntmen on the Nene Valley Railway in Cambridgeshire, England. One of the leading stuntmen, a guy named Martin Grace, was severely injured during a scene when Bond has to climb on the side of a passenger car to get Bond girl Octopussy's attention. While hanging from the train, he hit a concrete post and was somehow able to cling on for dear life. Grace spent about 6 months in a hospital, but he was able to make a full recovery. In A View to a Kill, 14th Bond film and Moore's last, was the fire truck chase on the streets of San Francisco. While trying to make it back to the truck's rear steering to fend off the San Francisco police, the truck's ladder becomes loose. That was done for real on location, with stuntmen James Arnett and Mike Runyard hanging from the ladder. Bond is an exceptional skier, as seen in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, The Spy Who Loved Me, For Your Eyes Only, A View to a Kill, and The World Is Not Enough. One man who was centrally involved in choreographing these ski scenes from On Her Majesty's Secret Service until A View to a Kill was a German skier named Willy Bogner. Bogner competed at the 1960 Winter Olympics and won several skiing events in Europe. After his skiing career, Bogner decided to pursue a filmmaking career, and he was hired by Bond producers Cubby Broccoli and Harry Saltzman to coordinate the skiing sequences in the film. Very good skier. He was so good that he used to ski backwards down the slopes while getting shots of the film. Bogner's extensive work on Her Majesty's Secret Service was lauded, and he was brought back for The Spy Who Loved Me, where Bond skis away from some Soviet KGB bad guys in Austria. This was all choreographed by Bogner, but the big ski jump was something that was done separately that will be covered later in the video. In For Your Eyes Only, the 12th Bond film, Bond goes skiing in Cortina d'Ampezzo in northern Italy, and this scene included an extended chase where Bond on skis is chased away by the bad guys, including jumping off a ski jump. Bogner also got more shots inside a bobsled run by skiing down it and being tied to a bobsled while filming in front of the skiing stuntmen. The first sequence in A View to a Kill is a big ski chase that takes place in Siberia but was filmed near a glacier in Iceland that has a name I will not attempt to pronounce. There is also a scene where Bond snowboards away from the Soviet bad guys, and this would be the last Bond film Bogner worked on. This first skiing scene in a Bond film in 14 years was in The World Is Not Enough. Bond and Bond girl Elektra are chased by a team of bad guys sent by the main bad guy. Although the scene takes place in Azerbaijan, this scene was filmed on Mont Blanc near Chamonix, France, with the scene being directed largely by second unit director Vic Armstrong, and the stunts were coordinated by Simon Crane. One of the most notable stuntmen in the history of this film series is an American guy named Rick Sylvester. Born in 1942 and raised in California, Sylvester was a rock climber and skier who seemingly had no fear, and he performed two of the greatest stunts ever seen on film, including, perhaps, the greatest stunt in the history of the series, if not one of the greatest stunts ever performed. This particular stunt was in The Spy Who Loved Me, one of the greatest of all Bond films. At the end of this early scene, Bond performs a spectacular base jump off a mountain, does a backflip, and parachutes away from the KGB bad guys who are chasing him. Although this scene takes place in Austria, this stunt was done at Mount Asgard in the Canadian Arctic in July 1976 under the direction of second unit director John Glenn, as this was the only suitable tabletop-like mountain where such a stunt could be done. Sylvester was helicoptered to the mountain, and Glenn filmed Sylvester skiing off the mountain and parachuting away. The mountain base jump was the most spectacular stunt scene in any Bond film. The mountain fall in For Your Eyes Only was undoubtedly the craziest and most dangerous. While climbing a mountain in central Greece to reach a monastery where the bad guys are staying, Bond nearly makes it to the top where he gets kicked off by a guard, and he free falls before his climbing rope stops his fall. Sylvester also performed this stunt for real, and visual effects supervisor Derek Meddings came up with a way to stop the rope from stopping abruptly. If not, the whiplash from the abrupt fall would have broken Sylvester's neck and snapped the rope, and Sylvester would have been dead before he hit the ground. The most amazing thing about this stunt was that Sylvester did it with no parachute, because he stopped falling about 350 feet or 110 meters from the ground, and he would have had no time to deploy a parachute from that height. Another two major contributors to the James Bond films are American aerial stuntmen B.J. Worth and Jake Lombard. Their contributions to scenes involving skydiving and other aerial stunt work in Bond films from Moonraker to Tomorrow Never Dies was crucial to all these films' successes. One of the most notable stunt scenes they did was the aerial battle at the beginning of Moonraker. While not the best Bond film, Moonraker certainly has its moments. After a pilot escapes a plane he crippled, Bond is pushed out of said crippled plane by Jaws, one of the all-time great Bond villains. He then sees the pilot, steals his parachute, and survives, even after being attacked by Jaws. In this scene, Bond is played by Lombard, the evil pilot and Jaws are both played by Worth. There were close-ups of Moore and Keel filmed on a front projection set up at Pinewood Studios. But the skydiving footage was filmed above Napa Valley, California in May 1978, and it took 88 jumps over 5 weeks to film this scene with second unit director John Glenn directing. One problem with this scene is that there wasn't a 35mm camera or lens that could film in such intense conditions, so they had to buy one of each in Paris and modify them to take and be able to film in 35mm film. One thing you notice is that the stuntmen all appear to not have parachutes. Worth and Lombard had hidden parachutes inside their costumes, otherwise they obviously couldn't do the jump. And the footage appears to be shaky in close-ups because the filmmakers didn't want to show the stuntmen's faces for continuity's sake. The climactic scene in Octopussy, the 13th Bond film, is one where Bond goes after the main bad guy who is escaping in a plane with Bond girl Octopussy and his main henchman in tow. The henchman goes outside to take care of Bond after he disables one of the plane's engines, but Bond manages to knock him off. This scene was done with Lombard playing Bond and Worth playing the henchman, and both had hidden parachutes. Because the scene involves opening a plane door, Worth and Lombard were able to go back in and out of the airplane and do their mid-air stunt work of hanging onto the plane, without it having to land all the time. Although this scene takes place in India, it was filmed over Utah in the United States. Another notable sequence that B.J. Worth and Jake Lombard worked on was the spectacular plane fight in The Living Daylights, the first of the two Timothy Dalton Bond films. This scene was filmed in 3 continents, and involved Bond and bad guy Necros, what a name, inside a C-130 Hercules cargo plane hanging from a net filled with bags full of raw opium. The scenes inside the plane were filmed in a set built inside Pinewood Studios, and the scenes where you see the actors' faces while they are hanging from the net, like this or this, were also filmed in Pinewood Studios, filmed in front of a front projection screen setup, and this has to be some of the best looking front projection footage ever shot, almost at the level of digital green screen. The shots where you see the whole Hercules in the sky were filmed at the Ouarzazate airfield in Morocco, where the big airbase battle was filmed, and the shots where you see Bond and Necros fighting with each other while hanging from the net when you don't see the actors' faces, that was filmed over the Mojave Desert in Southern California over a 3-day period. Although they had hidden parachutes underneath their costumes, Worth and Lombard were actually hanging off a real plane that was 6,500 feet up, holding on for dear life. And Worth and Lombard were directed and filmed by second unit director Arthur Wooster from both a Learjet that was flying right next to the cargo plane and from the cargo plane itself. And for the footage filmed over the Mojave Desert, they didn't use a quad-engine C-130 Hercules, but rather they used a smaller but similar-looking twin-engine C-123 Provider, also known as the Con Air airplane, and painted it the same color as the Hercules. You can actually see when Necros falls to his death that the plane has two engines right there. Worth played Bond, and Lombard played Necros. Sometimes the winds and aerodynamic buffeting was so intense that they would get flung off, and that meant that the Provider and the Learjet would both have to land and they would have to start all over again. The physical nature of doing these stunts was noted for how grueling they were to do. Irish actor Pierce Brosnan was chosen to be the 5th actor to play James Bond in 1994, and his first film was GoldenEye. One of the most famous stunts of the whole series was the bungee jump scene at the start of the film. This was done for real by a bungee jumper named Wayne Michaels at the Verzasca Dam in Switzerland. A little later on, one of the more spectacular scenes in the film is the scene where Bond base jumps off an elevated runway, goes after a falling plane that is about to crash into mountains, gets in the plane, manages to save it, and flies off. Another guy named Jacques Malnuit jumped off Tavistock Mountain in Switzerland with a dirt bike, and B.J. Worth did the freefall, and this was achieved using forced perspective, making it look like Worth was falling near mountains. Brosnan was filmed in front of a front projection screen getting into the plane set at Pinewood Studios. This was considered one of the more sci-fi type of stunts, as this stunt is likely physically impossible to do. In Tomorrow Never Dies, Brosnan's next Bond film, there is a scene where Bond does what's called a high-altitude low opening jump, or halo jump, so he can go down into the South China Sea to find a downed British Royal Navy ship. This was another jump performed by B.J. Worth, this time over Florida. In Casino Royale, the first of the Daniel Craig Bond films, has a spectacular chase where Bond chases a guy through a building construction site in Africa. Although digital effects had come up to the point where this could be done largely digitally, it was decided to do it for real, with Craig and his stuntman Ben Cook chasing a character played by Sébastien Faucan, a famous French freerunner who made a living running up walls and structures without support in Paris. The train chase near the beginning of Skyfall, the 23rd Bond film, was done largely for real, and Daniel Craig did some of his own stunts, with his stunt double Andy Lister doing the riskiest stuff. Instead of being filmed against blue and green screen, this scene was shot almost entirely on location in Turkey, and director Sam Mendes wanted to ensure the least amount of digital effects were used to give the scene a feeling of raw realism. The cars coming off the train was all real, and Craig did his own stunts when his face was seen while filming on top of the train. Of course, Craig and the stunt people were all given protection with wires that were erased digitally in post-production. Bond being kicked off the train was done partially for real, with Lister being kicked off, but the fall itself when Bond hits the water was CGI, as it was too dangerous or too impractical to do it any other way. The 25th James Bond film, No Time to Die, featured a big motorcycle jump. Bond is riding a motorcycle and uses a rock staircase to get up to a higher level. A big wooden ramp was built, and this stunt was performed by former dirt bike enduro champion Paul Edmondson. The ramp was covered over with digital rock and stone later on.